Welcome. Thank you all for tuning in today for our conversation about the postponed Magnum Live Lab that was supposed to be held in Atlanta this past March. I'm Greg Harris. I'm one of the High Museum's photography curators. I'm joined by Carolyn Drake, who's in Vallejo, California, and Lindokuhle Sobekwa and Mikhael Subotzky, who are both in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'd like to thank our partners at Magnum Photos, notably Pauline Vermar and Sophie Wright, for all their hard work in organizing the Live Lab, and Vanessa Patriani and Bruno Bailey for helping to spread the word. At the High Museum, I'd like to thank Alex Davis, Eva Berlin, Kristen Brown, and Ashley Wills for their valuable contributions to this panel and also to the related series of interviews that we posted on the High Museum's blog. So if you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to take a look at those interviews at some point. And finally, I'd like to thank the Hagen Foundation for their support of the Live Lab. Also, we'll take questions at the end, so feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A field. So we've convened this panel today to talk about artists' creative process and how artists respond to, record, and work through current events. In this case, a global pandemic, and additionally ongoing protests against racial injustice. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a particularly fraught time, and we're all grappling with a difficult but necessary dialogue about systemic racism and police brutality against people of color. It's a dialogue that came to a head a few weeks ago here in the US, but it's now become a global conversation. As the historic heart of the civil rights movement, these issues have hit home here in Atlanta particularly hard, even more so in light of the recent murder of Rayshard Brooks. And as we've been preparing for this panel about how artists respond to and help us make sense of current events, the pressing need for racial justice has been at the top of our minds and will no doubt be part of our discussion today. To give a little background for this conversation, this all sprung from a project we've been planning for over a year called the Magnum Live Lab. Back in March, just as the US was going into lockdown, we were planning to host Carolyn, Lindo, and Mikhael at the High Museum in Atlanta for a 2-week residency. The idea was that they'd all make new work responding to the city of Atlanta or to pieces that are in the High Museum's collection. So we turned a gallery just off our main piazza into an open working studio that was supposed to be our base of operations. Lindo and Carolyn were planning to go out into the city and shoot, and Mikhael would work in the lab on a collage and an animated film. As they were working, the space would be open to the public so they could see the progress in real time and engage directly with all the artists. We wanted to make the process of artists creating new work, collaborating with one another, sharing ideas, and the process of building an exhibition, so editing, refining, debating with the curator and other museum staff. We wanted to make all of that as transparent as possible. So it was somewhat of a risky proposition that we were entering into. In a way, we were all going to be performing without a net. At the end of that 2-week residency, we'd hang the work on the walls and invite everyone back to see what we put together. But clearly, none of that happened, at least not yet anyway. 2 days before we were set to open, the whole country went into lockdown, the museum closed, and we all went home. A few days later, Mikhael started up a WhatsApp thread with all of us just to check in, see how everyone was doing. Thanks to an autocorrect or a slip of his fingers, it was mistakenly titled Love Lab in Quarantine, which all gave us a good chuckle. Everyone was safely, if anxiously, at home, and we were just exchanging messages for a few days at that point. After a couple weeks, to my delight, all 3 of the artists started sharing images of what they'd been making since the lockdown began. Linda was going out into Johannesburg to document the early days of the pandemic. Carolyn had begun work on a studio component of the project she'd been planning to pursue in Atlanta, and Mikhael started working on the collage based on an object in the Heist collection that he'd intended to make here in Atlanta, but he brought it back to Johannesburg with him and started making it there. And so because the original spirit of the Live Lab had always been to share our creative process with our audience, we wanted to keep that spirit alive. And so here we are today to check in on what's been happening. I should also note that the work we're going to be looking at today, I have a PowerPoint that I'll share as the artists are talking. It's all work that is in progress. So Carolyn, Lindo, and Mikhael have been very generous to allow us to pull back the curtain a bit and look at the projects and pieces that are still unfinished. So all of this work will inevitably evolve and be refined. So Lindo, can you tell us about the photographs you made upon returning to South Africa? What were you seeing and how did working during the pandemic change the way you photographed?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic, I think what did change was, to keep the regulation of the COVID-19 to social distance, and there was no much engagement I was having with the people I was photographing, and also with my family. So when I returned from Houston, I quarantined for 2 weeks at Mikhael's house, where I was also looking at how people were responding to this pandemic here. And after that, I went back home, and we had to separate as well, and to keep the regulation to social distance. So that's I think that's what it has changed.
So tell us about some of the, what were you seeing? So I have some of your pictures up on the screen right now. The one of the woman holding a bucket at a spigot.
Yeah. So in this photograph, for example, this is a communal tab in Polar Park where I live. So these are people who, the women in the photograph, these are people who are cleaning the communal toilets that we have. And also the boy there was, just taking water for home or something like that. So, I was looking at how this pandemic, was affecting my community, and, it has been making it for us difficult to keep the regulation of the COVID-19, washing hands, for example, where also we have, few challenges of water shortage, or maybe electricity, for example, which is like our constant problem. We are on and off. We have power cuts problem. And also, a lot of people are unemployed, so it's been really difficult for them to maybe hustle in the street or something like that. Like, for example, in the photograph that are in the broadcast here, it's a photograph of a strike that happened in Thokoza, just near where I live. People were complaining of electricity problem. And on the left photograph, it's a photograph of my girlfriend, little sister. So, these are the things that has been making it, very difficult for us to, to obey, I think, the rules of COVID-19.
I know here in the U.S., the pandemic really revealed a lot of the systemic inequity that existed here in our society. Was that the same in Johannesburg? Did it kind of throw things open and really reveal how stratified the culture really was?
Yes, Johannesburg, it is, a very divided place, or South Africa, it is divided, by class, by race, and so this pandemic, sort of show the inequality that exists within the country. Because in the township, like I've said, it was, the rules of the pandemic were, I think, pretty unfair within the township, because, the township were meant to confine people, really, and there's no enough space to, to quarantine, and it's not common to find a family of 10 living in one shack, for example. So, those are the things I think I was looking at.
So this picture that we have up on the screen of the children looking through a doorway, it's one of my favorite pictures that I've seen that you've made. Can you tell us a little bit about this one? What was the situation you photographed?
Yeah, so during the lockdown, a few shops were told to close down unless they had the permit to open. So this is one of the local tuck shop in Polar Park. It was an interesting, I think, scene, where people were kind of going to supermarket to buy maybe, stuff for home, or maybe, sweets for kids or something like that. And also to have dogs in that, I think that's all.
That's a great one. Thanks, Anu. I'm gonna give Carolyn a moment here. So Carolyn, when you returned home, you began working on a number of things in your studio, some based on ongoing research you've been doing, others based on new challenges that you proposed for yourself. Can you tell us about all of these different threads that you've been exploring, and how did the restriction of staying home or in your studio shape the way you approached the work you were doing?
Well, so the Live Lab was canceled, and also a few other projects that I had planned to work on away from home. But I did have some things that I had also been lining up to work on in my studio. And one of them was a series. I've been incorporating quilting into my practice over the past couple of years. And the first thing, this quilt that you're looking at on the screen now is the first of 3 quilts that I had planned on putting together that relate to gun violence, and specifically police violence, for the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago for an exhibition they're having next year. And so I had kind of done a lot of research already and kind of conceptual work to think about this quilt that I was going to make, which is basically trying to visualize a stark statistic, which I found, which is last year in 2019, 1,004 people were killed by police officers in the United States. And so what I had decided to do was to try and visualize this number. And I purchased many police uniforms on eBay of various materials. And when they arrived, I cut them into squares, and I constructed this quilt that's made up of 1,004 pieces of police uniforms. So that's one thing. It was a very time-consuming project, and the kind of production of it started very soon after the lockdown began. And while I was working on that, I definitely felt a sense of like frustration, of kind of being enclosed, of feeling restricted, and of also wanting to do something that was more immediate, and to feel a sense of somehow to put a structure in my schedule and in my daily life, which I didn't feel I had, and I had no idea of what the future held, because it was kind of every day was something new. So kind of as a creative outlet and response to that, I gave myself this kind of assignment or project to, every morning I would get up at 5 and start building these sculptures made out of organic material from my backyard, and then also some things from inside my house, and kind of merging them into these sculptures that I would photograph as they evolved and changed. And it all kind of had to happen before the wind came up, because every morning in Vallejo, by about 10 o'clock in the morning, not only does the sun get really bright, but the wind comes in. And so these sculptures that I was building were kind of precarious and always about to fall over. And that was kind of also the feeling that I had, like having is this kind of crumbling, that was the world on the verge of crumbling. So yeah, so these sculptures, I kind of started making them every morning, and they would have to finish by the time the wind came in. And after George Floyd was killed, I felt, actually the image on the left is the last one I made right after George Floyd was killed. And I felt I needed to put this on pause after that happened. So this is, I think this is a project I will continue, but there's something about this moment that just doesn't feel, there's a discomfort on many levels about this moment, but making these sculptures, especially because they're also kind of part of my self-assignment was to post them on Instagram and to kind of reveal the process of making them. And I didn't feel like these were the most appropriate thing to be kind of sharing on social media during this moment. And what, oh yeah, and then I don't know if you have the Baldwin project, but
Yeah. So you had pretty ambitious plans for the time in life.
yeah, I mean, basically, I'm not very good at making myself small assignments. So I figured if I was going to do something, Atlanta is to me, as an American and as someone who's only been focusing my work on this country since I moved back from Istanbul like 6 or 7 years ago, like trying to kind of make work that responds to this country is really has been really challenging for me, but responding to Atlanta in particular is even more of a challenge. And I thought I should use the Live Lab as a chance to start something big and deep rather than, you know, something that could be finished in 2 weeks, which I felt like, yeah. So I found this, in my research, I found this book by James Baldwin called The Evidence of Things Unseen. And I've read a lot of other material about Atlanta, but that book in particular, I really clung onto because I really, his whole approach of like critique, like he questions every fact that is put in front of him and tries to look at the underlying structures of racism and profiteering that those facts reveal. And so basically that his book, The Evidence of Things Unseen, was first published in Playboy magazine in 1980. And I bought a copy of that issue of Playboy and looked at the articles and the contents of the magazine. And I found that when I took out the porn in Playboy and all the articles, you're left with this collection of advertisements, which is putting forth this very kind of elitist white version of masculinity. And so the relationship between what Baldwin was trying to write about and that imagery, to me, was something I wanted to work with. And this is very much in progress. Like I've shared it and talked about it with some of my friends here in Vallejo, who are, one of my friends in particular who's very into literature and African-American literature, and kind of sorting through the problems in the way I've presented it, which I can elaborate on later, but I feel like maybe it's time to share some of the space with Mikhael now.
Sure. So one more image in that. Great, thank you, Carolyn. So Mikhael, you work primarily in your studio these days using a number of different media. What kinds of creative challenges did working from home present for you? What was the work that you were doing when you got back and went into lockdown? And did you feel compelled in any way by the circumstances of the pandemic to change how you worked?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, just to say I'm incredibly lucky to be able to kind of pack up what is my studio, or equipment from my studio, which is on the other side of town, and bring it home to work here. You know, I mean, Lindokuhle's images, I've seen them 100 times now, all those images, but they are just such a powerful and searing insight and critique to exactly what you were saying, Greg. You know, that the virus has just kind of highlighted the inequality and disparity, which in South Africa, you know, all these years after the end of apartheid is so stark, and to the point where, you know, Lindokuhle was worried about the electricity where he lives this evening, and so he came to what is still a largely white suburb where I live to do the Zoom call. So I think that's kind of really an important background, and kind of highlights my own white privilege, that, you know, that I've just been able to kind of fluidly move between different, different versions of how I was going to be working anyway, while Lindokuhle has been struggling with his power supply, So, I'm just very, very aware of that. But getting back to the high and the live lab, I was pretty much going to do something similar, pack up prints that I made in my studio and some of my equipment and work on a pop-up studio in the museum. So instead I've just kind of replaced the museum with one of the rooms in my house, which isn't quite as glamorous, but I can very much work here. Greg and myself had a great correspondence before me going there around some of the works from the High's collection that I might be interested in engaging with. For about 5-6 years now, the real focus of my work has been white masculinity and kind of collapsing the ideology of colonialism from within the gaze of the white male. What you're seeing now are some previous works that have done this, some of my collage techniques, and I was going to really be and have been applying these same inquiries and these same techniques to some source images from the High's collection, and I think Greg will get to some of those in a little while. But to answer your question more directly, it's just really been carrying on and trying to work.
It's a pretty unique process that you work with, the sticky tape transfer. Can you tell us a little bit about it? We've got an image of you making one up right now.
Yeah. So this is a technique I first started using many years ago. I think in 2012. I discovered it just by taping a work print to the wall, and when I pulled it off, it removed some of the ink from the print, and I was amazed by the clarity. So it's developed over the years, and what I do, as you see here, is apply clear tape to the front of an image, and that is one of the works from the High's collection. It's a sculpture by Edmonia Lewis of Christopher Columbus in this very kind of patronizing male in control of the world pose with a Native American woman by his feet. And that work is a lot more complex than that, which we can maybe get to later, in terms of the fact that it was made by an African American part Native sculptor, female sculptor, so it's very complex. But it is, on first view, really a classical 19th century image of power and masculinity. I put the tape on, sometimes in very carefully placed strips, sometimes quite randomly and haphazardly, following the energy and the flow and the composition of the work, as I did here, and then pull the tape away, which removes the ink from the support. And then the image on the right is turning it over and then scrubbing at the back to remove the ink and some of the paper. And that kind of not only allows the image to be eroded and for the kind of certainty and clarity and power of the pose to be denuded, but it also kind of introduces an almost kind of painterly element where the ink can be moved around the surface and kind of, I guess, an element of expressionism in my relationship to the violence. And I guess it's me wanting to kind of strip away and do violence to the images, which are very violent images in their original form.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really powerful piece. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit. The members of Magnum have a long history of recording and responding to major global events, wars, revolutions, civil unrest, and other crises. And one way or another, you're all visual storytellers working from and against that lineage. So I'm wondering how, if at all, does that tradition inform the work that you make? I know, Lindo, that the work of Ernest Cole is an important touch point for you. And do you feel that you're using your work now to chronicle the events of the past 3 months, the pandemic, the protests and the other responses to racial injustice, either directly in kind of a documentary manner or more expressively? I mean, Carolyn, you talked about how the murder of George Floyd impacted kind of what you were doing, and you made a piece, kind of in a series that you've been doing that already responded to that. Mikhael, a lot of your work lately is about white privilege and power structures. So I'm curious, as members of Magnum, you're kind of taking on that mantle. I'm curious how you think about how your work does kind of respond to these current events and fit into that larger tradition that you're all part of.
For me, I can't actually say, I mean, I'm relatively new to Magnum, and I can't actually say that I'm well versed in the history of Magnum and the photography that's been there. I mean, I've found it really important since joining that institution to make sure that I maintain a sense of purpose and inspiration that's not necessarily confined to looking within Magnum, and kind of, so for me, seeking inspiration from outside is very important. I think Magnum is undergoing a lot of, hopefully, is undergoing a lot of change right now. And I'll let you guys, the other two guys, say something.
You guys are comfortable with that. I mean, I'd like to talk about that at some point, maybe a little bit later on in the discussion, but I think that's something, if you all feel comfortable, that I'd like to try to touch on a little bit. Then I guess, how do you, to make it a little bit more specific and kind of pull it away from, from Magnum, how do you see the work that you're doing as, responding to this very unusual time that we're all living in?
Linda, do you want to go, or should I?
Yeah, maybe go first.
Well, I mean, to link those two questions, I think it's a wonderful and exciting time within Magnum. I mean, we have a number of young photographers and kind of newer photographers who aren't necessarily the younger generation, but they're really kind of bringing fantastic work and new energy and new kind of perspectives and voices into Magnum. I mean, Lindokuhle is a wonderful example, but there are many, many more. And I'm quite close to this at the moment because foolishly, I kind of volunteered myself to help build a new element to kind of Magnum's presence online, and we've called that Magnum Flow. Foolishly, because it took up a lot of time. But for me, it was really an opportunity to engage both with the work that's being produced at the moment all over the world. And it came out very much of this kind of moment of sharing with each other via email how we were all responding to lockdown. And also to look at the archive and Magnum, yes, in some kind of parts, it has a reputation of being a very kind of Western-centric, male-dominated organization. But once you really dig into it, the variety and the kind of depth and the interest of the work and the diversity of the work is surprising, to be honest. And perhaps maybe it's also my distance from photography. What I'm doing as my main work in the studio is kind of very different to the idea of the Magnum photographer's work. And that allows me maybe a bit of distance to engage with what my colleagues are doing. And hopefully Flow really gives a sense of how different people in very different circumstances have responded to this very commonly held global thing, So it's affected, and in my lifetime, nothing like this has ever affected the whole world. And to see the variety, the commonalities and the differences in the responses and the circumstances, the exaggerations of inequality, but all of that has kind of been filtered through our lenses, I guess. And for me, it's been extremely interesting and quite inspiring in tough times, actually, to see that happening.
Since you brought it up, Mikhael, can you tell us a little bit more specifically about Magnum Flow, what it is, how it's set up, how it runs?
Yeah, it's so literally, I think on one of the first days of lockdown, and both Lindokuhle and myself had to kind of rush home before flights ended because we were both in the States already on our way to Atlanta. I think Peter van Achtmaal sent an email talking about a kind of pandemic diary. Yeah, we just started exchanging emails, and it really was quite moving to see, you know, so Lindokuhle would email some of the images that he's shown us and talk about his circumstances. David Hearn, who, you know, is a young man of 80-something in a small town in Wales, you know, made this incredible kind of diaristic presentation of his life there. You know, Saurabh Hora in India, you know, the list can go on and on. But yeah, it just really felt like, for one of the first times, maybe also in my kind of time in Magnum, the kind of global perspective and the breadth of the global perspective really started making sense. And I saw the strength of the different voices and different kind of regions where we work, you know, as opposed to this idea that Magnum is all, you know, New York, London, and Paris. And that was just super interesting for me. And I think it also allowed some of the generational gaps to be bridged. We were all kind of engaging. We started these Zoom calls every Monday, and yeah. So really, what the brief for Flow was to kind of find a way of presenting that kind of energy. And it's I guess it's nothing more than a kind of simple blog, but I really wanted. I worked with a small team: Olivia Arthur, Peter van Achtmaal, and Christina de Middel, and amazing developers called Photomat from the Netherlands. And we really wanted to kind of make it both very immediate in a kind of social media sense, where, you know, you could have this flow of images that were constantly updated, and also allow for a viewing format that kind of supported in-depth engagement, both with text and images and the relationship between the two. So it was a real attempt at that, and it's very new, so we don't really know if it's succeeding or not, but I do think that it is a kind of very honest and open and hopefully vulnerable presentation of the dialogue amongst ourselves.
That's great. I mean, I think it's a really interesting project. It has kind of a sense of immediacy that you don't often see from kind of an organization on that scale.
And sorry to interrupt, but to bring that back to the Live Lab, you know, that's exactly the what, you know, similar spirit to what we were hoping with the Live Lab. Like you said, what was it? Trapeze without the safety net, performing without the safety net. Yeah, and I think that's so appropriate. The world we live in, you know, in an institutional context, in a museum, in a kind of Magnum institutional context. The sense of being able to work quite lightly and immediately respond. You know, Flow was very much about our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then George Floyd got murdered, and, you know, it would have been disingenuous not to carry that energy into our responses to that, and, you know, difficult responses that are appropriate to how incredibly difficult that moment has been in the States, and then to get the international perspective because we are all over the world. And yeah, so in many ways, I think the fact that that's what I worked on also relates to what I would have been, how I would have been engaging at the Live Lab. And it just felt like, I mean, I really hope, and you'll talk about this, Greg, that we do get back to Atlanta and do the actual thing, because to have the kind of partnership of Magnum Photos in this new kind of more open, engaging form with a museum, you know, that has this incredible history and incredible collection, incredible program, but also, I guess, needs to find ways of engaging with its audience in ways that are kind of appropriate to these very, very confusing times. You know, that's a combination that I think has a huge potential for amazing work to be produced.
Absolutely. I think we're all trying to find ways to deepen the ties that we have to our community and make it seem like the museum is as open and accessible as possible. And this was, you know, one of the ways we're really hoping to do that. Carolyn, sorry, I jumped in ahead of you. What did you want to add to the conversation?
I just wanted to just something about Magnum, that the COVID lockdown, I think what has been really interesting to see happen in Magnum is that this lockdown ended up bringing people together in a way that they never have before, basically because of Zoom. And it made us all desire connection, and we have managed to do that through these Zoom calls, which have triggered conversations that people in the agency have never had before. And that's been really valuable to me. And also, I mean, it's made me feel more engaged with the agency than I have in the 4 or 5 years since I joined. And also, you know, and feeling the opportunity and right to speak about things that have gone kind of silent in the past. But also, just to say one more thing I appreciate about Magnum is to kind of experience what's happening here in the US, and whatever kind of class and racial divisions that are revealed by COVID and then by the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, and to hear how people in other countries within Magnum are reacting to that, whether it's Lindo or Nusha in Iran or Sohrab in India. Like, those voices I've really appreciated having them in my life. It just expands my understanding of the world and kind of my place in it, I think.
So picking up on that thread a little bit, one of the things that we were hoping to get into and explore in the context of the Live Lab was collaboration and how artists collaborate with one another. So maybe Linda, you could take this one. I'm just curious, like, you know, you're relatively new to Magnum, but what have been the opportunities that you've had to collaborate with other artists, and kind of what form do those collaborations take?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, most of the time I work alone, and I did a body of work called Delside with a French photographer who's really a close friend of mine. So went to a community of Delside, which I'm familiar with, and we most of the time we work together, and sometimes we'll go back to France and maybe I'll work alone. But for me, the Atlanta Live Lab was gonna be like an opportunity for me to work with, you know, the two colleagues of mine, Mikhael and Caroline, and to learn something from them, and maybe, you know, they can learn something from me too. And also maybe learning something from the public of Atlanta, because, you know, I'll be working on a landscape that I'm not familiar with. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I was hoping this to be a learning curve for me.
Yeah, there'd be like an opportunity for feedback and for dialogue, to have kind of an ongoing conversation, yeah, about the work. Do you, Carolyn, Mikhael, do either of you've both spent a little more time in Magnum, but what kind of opportunity does it present for collaboration within that context?
I mean, there's been a long history of group projects within Magnum, and I don't know that history very well, but and they've involved different degrees of kind of collaboration or working in proximity to each other. And I was involved in one quite a few years ago, which was loosely called Postcards from America. We always tried to change the name because we didn't like the name, but it just kind of stuck, which was amazing for me. It was, you know, really getting to work alongside and engage with amazing people who I really look up to, like Jim Goldberg and Susan Marcellus, and you know, we did road trips and things like that. And so more recently there was one that I wasn't involved in. I think Carolyn was, which was called the Borders Project, working along the Mexican border with America. And I think always, yeah, that working in proximity allows for a kind of exchange that is very rich, kind of butting up against all the problems of photography and the difficulties of photography together is often very meaningful, and then trying to find a way of presenting the work that integrates all the different voices and speaks to, yeah, a kind of common reality. That's all.
touching on another thread that came up a bit earlier, but it's pretty rare for an artist to offer as much insight, particularly in real time, as you all signed up to do in the live lab, and as we're doing a little bit here. So I'm curious, how do you all feel about revealing yourselves in this way, or to put it another way, like how much is too much to share, kind of about, I don't know, how everything comes together? To see like the messiness of your work, because usually I think most people are accustomed to seeing, you know, the finished beautiful piece, you know, hung on the wall or sitting on a pedestal, such as it is, and you know, you're letting us see so much more than that. How do you feel about that?
I felt very anxious about it, to be honest, about being in the live lab, because I did not know exactly what I wanted to do. And I just felt I needed time being there in order to figure it out. And my process is fraught with self-doubt and revision. And it happens over a long period of time. So I was definitely anxious about it, but I think that what I ended up doing in my backyard with these sculptures, I have these surveillance cameras that I embed in each of the sculptures that kind of look back at me, so that while I'm looking at and building the sculpture, it's watching me back, and there's this kind of two-way vision that happens. And I think that the videos that are recorded as I work have this sense of, I mean, they're a full kind of exposure of my anxious character when I'm making work. And I feel in a way like that plan that I had to kind of disclose myself at the live lab, somehow I took that into these sculptures and did that anyway.
It's been really fun seeing all of those on Instagram as you're working together. Yeah, so go ahead.
So to answer that question from my perspective, I think it's so important, and again, a great credit to the High Museum as an institution for kind of going for a project like this, which there's our vulnerability and messiness, and you know, the museums as well. It's a partnership in that vulnerability, which is amazing and so important for established museums like yours to go with. And it completely relates to my work. Vulnerability is something that I've always felt important to engage with and to open myself up to in my work. White men, like everybody else, they feel fear and vulnerability and anxiety, and I think so much of the violence that white men have visited on people all around them over so many hundreds of years has come from this inability and this decision not to show vulnerability. And you see that in all the kind of quote unquote great classical works of art. They all present the white man as this kind of in control figure, so comfortable in his power. And as a white man myself, I feel like one of the ways to kind of engage with that and erode that is to, be vulnerable myself. And I think I often want my works to remain open, to kind of be open wounds that aren't finished. I'm surrounded by bits of sticky tape, and this is a finished work, but it's also really just a kind of a piece of tape, and okay, at some point it'll get put in a frame and put on the wall maybe, but even when that happens, I don't want it to be a closed thing. I don't want it to be a closed system. I want it to be open to the world and open to the viewer to kind of literally kind of get inside it and engage with it on a visceral level. So yeah, as you can hear, like engaging in a kind of more open and vulnerable ways is very much up my street.
So go ahead.
So yeah. No, I just wanted to pick it up from where Mikhael was talking about this idea of vulnerability. I think I found the beauty in being vulnerable, in talking about my own stories that concern me, stories that affect me, and I think there's a beauty in that. I mean, with the Live Lab, project. I had those mixed feelings of anxiousness and the feeling of learning something new from it. So yeah, I just want to say that.
Well, as someone from the outside, I just want to say thank you to all of you for making yourselves that vulnerable and sharing all of that with us. It's very generous. Picking up on this thread about different power structures, we touched about it a little bit earlier, but about Magnum historically being dominated by white male photographers, and someone submitted a question to this effect. And so one of the things I'm curious is, like, what are the efforts that you all in Magnum are taking to bring in more diverse perspectives? Specifically, this question asked, it takes 4 years to become a full member. So is that an obstacle for greater diversity and renewal within the ranks of Magnum? And you could take that specific point or any other thing, because I know it's a fairly rigorous process.
I think there's a variety of points of view on that. So different people in Magnum will have a different answer to that. My point of view, which I have expressed very adamantly, is that yes, it is an obstacle for greater diversity. I believe that the hierarchy of the nominee structure is not needs to be revised a bit so that there's more equality between the people who are participating in the agency.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to add to that, whatever structure you have for joining, I think, like every other organization in this moment, we have to look at ourselves and say what we've done in terms of addressing these issues is not good enough. And we need to do more. We need it to be more urgent. And we need to look at ourselves very deeply in the same vulnerable way that we're talking about. That being said, at the same time, I also, we've engaged with this a lot amongst ourselves in the last couple of weeks and days. And while both acknowledging that we need to do more and we've made many mistakes and a lot of what we've done is not good enough, I've also been pleasantly surprised to see the kind of level of the engagement and also how far we have come. Again, we speak about these kind of diverse global voices from Iran to India to South Africa to Turkey. I think it's also been important looking at ourselves critically, also not to beat ourselves up and to say, look, we also do have incredible strengths.
So I'm reading some of the questions that we've gotten. There's a few good ones. Someone submitted a question that says, in response to COVID-19, Zoe Whiteley talked about artists as first responders. Is this an insight that you share? I mean, Linda, you've been kind of out kind of on the front lines, such as it is. I mean, do you feel that that's an accurate comparison to the way that you're working?
Yes, I mean, so much of my work, it's, it has to do with what concerns me and what affect, people that I'm close to. So I felt the responsibility to document this time, like right now, and, how I respond to it and how my community respond to it and how my community respond to it. So I felt that, that this is something that needs to be documented and, kept in whatever archive or maybe distributed in public spaces, which was one of the projects that was in mind in Magnum photographers to, yeah. I don't know if I'm allowed to share it, but yeah.
Sorry to keep you on the spot, Linda, but we got another question specifically for you. It says, From Theo, it says, in Brazil, we photographers are constantly dealing with harassment and threats from people who think we should end lockdowns and other measures in order to save the economy. I'd like to hear some input from Lindokuhle to know if he's facing things like that. So, are you, when you're out in Thokoza, is the sense that things need to open up again, just for the sake of getting people back to work?
Yeah, I mean, South Africa now is on level 3, meaning that some of the things have been like opened up, like alcohol, and a lot of people have went back to work. But also the numbers are going higher, so it's still also a bit, risky at the moment. So, I mean, we just, anxious, I think, for our loved ones who are in potential, risk to being infected. Because also my mother went back to work. Who's like 60-something years old now. So I mean, I'm constantly like sort of worried about her and and her health in whenever she goes to work, because she goes with a communal taxi. So yeah, I mean, yeah.
I'm just staying healthy.
Can I
Please
jump in? Well, it's just so interesting hearing Linda talk in response to Zoe Whitley's comment that somebody posted. And Zoe is a great friend of mine, so it's very nice to have her voice here, even in absence. But yeah, this idea of a first responder in I guess Linda's terms, and one could put it, not that that's what Linda is doing, but in journalistic terms, is very appropriate. It's like. It's very important for us all to know what his pictures are telling us about people's responses and about the way COVID is affecting people's lives. At the same time, I really do believe in art as a kind of very important psychological processing tool for society. So much has been written about how we deal with not being able to communicate with each other in person, how we deal with having to be productive at home. And yeah, I think art is just, and the production of art is such an important way for society to work through what it is facing. And, like everybody else, I spend so much time on Instagram, and it is really amazing, both in relation to COVID and in relation to Black Lives Matter, to kind of be a part of a community that is trying to process very, very complex, difficult things. And some people in that community are very, very close to it, and others are at a distance. But it really does give us an opportunity to think through the things that we need to think through if we are going to build a different kind of society.
I heard an interview not too long ago, and forgive me, I forget who was speaking. I believe it was a filmmaker who said that that art doesn't necessarily need to be diagnostic, but can also be prescriptive. That not only does it show us the world as it is, but it shows us the world as it can be. So I think that a lot of the work that all of you do, because it is so. It's so deeply thought through, and there are so many layers of different kinds of processes and sources and materials that you're bringing in, that it sort of gives us this better sense of kind of where things could go, and gives us a way to really reflect on on the state of the world. In the last few minutes that we have, someone asked a great question, which was pretty close to the line as how I was hoping to end up. So, but I'll take their lead on this one. So. The Live Lab was originally going to be a fast and furious project on site. Now that we are in this extended and suspended moment where you have a chance to reflect and or continue to work on what you were originally going to do on site, but world events have changed everything. How do you think your time on site, hopefully next year in Atlanta, yes, hopefully, thank you for that, will be different? So are you thinking about Atlanta audiences differently? I think this is a great question. This is something that I've been thinking about for the last several weeks. When we were putting this together, we'd been trying to plan it for a year, but by the time we finally got confirmation that it was happening, everything came together very quickly, and it was just in the last few weeks running up to the Live Lab that we were starting to really formalize the ideas that you all were going to be pursuing while you were here. So now that we've got probably at least a year until it's actually going to happen again, if it truly does. How, a few threads here, like how do you think you'll approach your work differently? I know, Carolyn, you got to work on something that you would, initially thought would be kind of coming further down the line. But also, is there anything that we should rethink in terms of the structure of the lab and how we set things up, how we have people participate in the whole experience?
Those are two different questions there.
So pick whichever one most resonates with you.
I mean, on a personal level, in terms of the work that I'm doing and want to do, I think this break, this kind of extension of the time we have to think about it has definitely given me new thoughts about what I want to do. And it is as a result of having tried to build this quilt with the advertisements and the text of James Baldwin and talking to my friend about it. And it made me really want to go back into this text and identify visual references that James Baldwin puts forward and kind of unpack them. I mean, they're also kind of deep and referencing another text, and there's a lot of analogies to Bible stories and to the book and the film Gone with the Wind. And so I have kind of realized and had some ideas about images, photographic images that I'd like to make that deal directly with what those visual references. In terms of the structure, we should definitely have that conversation, all of us together.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, sorry, can I jump in?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think that I imagine, hopefully, when we do get back together in Atlanta, that will be a much kind of better, richer 2 weeks in the museum than if we hadn't had this kind of time of interacting and processing. And I think that's a good thing to think about for future versions of this, both in the museum and in the Magnum context. I think that, the crying wolf of doing it, got us all to a certain stage, and then almost kind of having all that, the preparation that we had done, and then interacting has kind of gotten us much further down the line than if we'd just arrived in Atlanta as originally planned. So I think setting up a structure where this kind of engagement can happen well before, in any case, not just because of the change of plans, would be very valuable.
Linda, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add?
Yeah. Well, no, I think Mikhael and Carolyn have covered it.
That's great. Sorry, it looked like you were about to talk. Well,
I mean, I'll just say,
go for it.
I've been asking myself from the very beginning, a project we should have an African-American person involved in this conversation. That's kind of structurally, I feel like if we could improve our group, that's how we could do it, because I think it would expand what we're talking about even further.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to have an Atlanta photographer involved in this too, someone who really knows the city and is deeply connected to the city and kind of the spirit and the character of this particular place. I mean, I think it's fantastic to have external perspectives like all of yours to bring to bear on this place. But I think as we're having a dialogue, I'm not originally from Atlanta. It's my recently adopted home. So there's only so much kind of expertise about the city that I can bring to the discussions that we'd be having about it. So I mean, I'd love to see an Atlanta photographer brought in if that's something that we could pull off.
That's a really nice idea.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it's looking good, but there's a few more hurdles we have to jump over before we get to that point. We've just hit an hour, so if none of you have anything else to add, I think we can sign off. Great.
I just
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all for for participating in all this and for indulging me all along the way and getting this all together. I really appreciate it. It's very kind of all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate you showing up.
Yeah, I just also want to thank Sophie Wright and Pauline at Magnum and yourself, Greg, and people who have helped fund this and the museum for being open to it. It's really a privilege to be a part of it. So thank you for having us.
Great. Oh, and I'm seeing this. Someone asked if we're recording this. We are recording it, and we will get it out through some channel through the museum and hopefully through Magnum at some point. But I don't know the technical end of that at the moment. But we'll figure it out. So probably the same ways you found out about this, you'll be able to figure out where the recording is. So thanks everyone. Be well.
Thanks.
Thank you.